On the morning of September 3rd, 1887, the thermometer nailed beside Elk Run's general store read 39 degrees at sunrise, though the light still carried late summer gold across the Dakota grass, and most of the town's 312 souls took that mild chill as a passing reminder rather than a warning. Elk Run stood 12 years old and proud of it, with one church, one schoolhouse, one general store, and enough new pine framing to convince men they had settled the land instead of merely borrowing it between seasons. Wagons creaked through ruts, horses stamped at the hitch rail, and smoke from cook stoves rose in thin, confident lines. Yet, north of town, on a quarter lot, others had refused for its stone and stubborn clay. 19-year-old Roy Tucker drove a shovel into hard ground with the deliberate rhythm of someone building for a winter no one else wished to imagine. Roy had his father's height, but not his father's broadness, being long-armed and lean from work done without pause, with wind-burned skin and steady gray eyes that seldom sought agreement before action. 4 years earlier, in March 1883, his father, Eli Tucker, had died of a lung fever in a trapping camp along a cottonwood bend east of the Missouri Breaks, after 3 days of breath that rattled and shortened until words came in fragments. Eli left little by way of property: 2 steel traps, a cast-iron pot with one handle cracked, a bay gelding too old for hard hauling, and a hand-copied notebook wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with rawhide. The notebook passed to Roy the morning after burial, when frost still held the top inch of soil and the preacher had already ridden south. That notebook did not contain grand theories or heroic speeches. It contained measurements, failures, revisions, and warnings. Eli had copied some passages from older trappers, some from a railroad man who wintered near Fort Union, and some from his own hard lessons in river-bottom camps where cold settled low and stayed. Pages listed trench widths, stove clearances, vent placements, and storage depths for potatoes, beans, and tallow. One page, written in darker pencil, carried the sentence Roy returned to more than any other: "Prairie cold does not merely freeze a man. It unthreads a town one household at a time." Eli had learned this over 2 decades of harsh winters, and before him Eli's mother had learned it in rough cabins on the Tennessee edge country, where families banked earth against log walls each autumn, not from fear alone but from plain arithmetic. Fuel was labor. Heat was time. Time was survival. Roy moved to Elk Run in June 1886 because it had work enough to keep him fed and distance enough to keep him from kin pity. He cut ties at the mill, hauled posts, dug privies, and slept where a corner could be rented for coins. He spoke little at card tables and less at church socials, not from contempt, but from habit, formed in camps where unnecessary speech cost daylight. By July 1887, he had saved $46.10. He spent $42 on a stony quarter lot north of town, where wagon wheels jarred on buried rock and spring mud, dried to plates hard as fired brick. Men said no kitchen garden would hold there, and no sensible husband would build there, and no prudent lender would stake a loan against ground that fought both plow and spade. Roy paid in full and took no loan. By the second week of September, he had laid out his footprint with cord and stakes, a rectangle 18 feet by 24, aligned so the long wall faced south and took low winter light. He set cottonwood posts at corners and intervals of 6 feet. Each post sunk 3 feet into clay he had to cut with pick and bar before he could shovel it clear. He framed inward, tight and plain, double planking the wall cavities with a 2-inch gap he intended to pack later with mixed earth and straw. His roof pitch stayed modest to reduce wind lift. With rafters he notched himself and tied with iron spikes bought 1 pound at a time, so cash could keep pace with need. The town watched as towns always watched unfamiliar labor, first with curiosity, then with commentary, then with consensus. Consensus arrived from Gideon Pike's porch. Pike owned the general store, kept the county freight ledger in his back office, and dressed as though weather were a nuisance for lesser men. His broadcloth coat came from St. Paul, his boots from a Chicago order, and his gloves stayed clean by habit and by having other hands lift the heaviest crates. He stood heavier than most men in Elk Run, well-fed and full-faced, with a trimmed mustache and a voice that carried to the far side of the hitch rail. He understood prices, credit, and the soft power of speaking first, in a place where information came by rumor before paper. When Roy began cutting sod from the flats and stacking blocks 12 inches thick in rows beside his frame, Pike observed for 3 mornings, then named the project where all could hear. "Tucker is not building a house," he said, one boot heel on his porch rail, laughter running ahead of the words. "He is digging himself a winter den. Look there, Tucker's gopher hole." The line moved through Elk Run by supper. Children repeated it on the school path. Teamsters repeated it at the well. Even those who pitied Roy used it because language travels easiest when it cuts and rhymes. Within a week, no one said the Tucker place without adding the name Pike had coined. Roy did not answer in public. He measured. He cut sod blocks in lengths of 22 inches, set them grass side down against his outer walls, and tamped each course with a flat maul until voids closed and seams locked. He hauled clay in a 2-wheel handcart from a borrow pit 40 yards upslope, wetting each load just enough for cohesion, then packing it between sod and plank in lifts no deeper than 6 inches, so settling would remain even. He built the earth bank outward at the base to a thickness of nearly 4 feet and narrowed it as it rose, shaping the berm so runoff would shed and not pool against timber. Where others saw dirt, he saw thermal mass and windbreak, and he worked with the patient severity of a mason setting stone. Costs governed each day. Cottonwood posts and rough pine took $16.30, nails and spikes $3.90, a second-hand cast-iron stove with tight seams $7, wagon hire for hauling heavier stone, $2, and a sack of flour promised later. He reused broken brick for stove footing and lined the immediate hearth zone with packed mineral soil to reduce spark risk. On clear afternoons, he tested draw with rolled paper and adjusted flue height by inches until smoke rose clean, even in crosswind. When evening came, he copied numbers into his own ledger, labor hours, materials used, and how long retained heat lasted after firebanking. Men at the hitch rail offered jokes, but no teams. One said he would help when Roy decided to build above ground like a Christian neighbor. Another asked whether Roy planned to hibernate. A third recommended marriage as a cure for odd notions. Roy lifted, tamped, and set without debate. His old bay horse, Cedar, stood hitched near the water barrel and watched with half-lidded calm as dust coated Roy's sleeves and dried to pale maps against sweat. Near month's end, Reverend Cole rode out and looked over the structure from the lot boundary, hat in both hands against a steady west wind. He spoke courteously, as men did when they wished to discourage without seeming cruel. "Roy, this appears severe for September. Elk Run has had hard spells and mild ones. Fear can become its own weather if fed too heavily." Roy leaned on his shovel, breath slow from effort rather than anger. "Reverend, this is not fear. It is arithmetic. Wind has no regard for sermons. Neither does frost." Cole nodded once, uncertain whether he had been rebuked, and rode back before sunset. By October 1st, first frost silvered the grass at dawn and vanished by 9. Roy had his main walls banked to shoulder height, and his entry set on the lee side with room left for a future vestibule. He began digging a root pit inside the north corner, 5 feet deep and lined with plank offcuts, and he laid out stone for a narrow trench path toward his well and woodshed, so winter drift would not sever movement between necessities. Children paused to stare at the half-buried walls. Women carrying parcels stopped and measured the berm with their eyes, then walked on. Pike, passing in his wagon, tipped his hat toward the mound and called to a companion. "There sits the finest gopher in Dakota." The companion laughed. Roy kept tamping earth until the maul rang dull and firm on every strike, then stood in the fading light and checked each wall, face by touch, searching for soft spots where wind might later pry and steal the heat he could not afford to lose. The first true cold had not yet arrived, but he built as though it were already walking toward Elk Run across the open miles. By full dark that same evening, September first air had fallen another 6 degrees, and a hard skin of frost gathered first on the shadowed side of Roy Tucker's berm, then on the bucket handles, then on the hitching rail where Cedar stood with breath smoking white. He carried a lantern through the doorway, set it on a crate, and lit the stove with split cottonwood no thicker than a wrist, then watched the thermometer he had nailed to an interior post climb from 41 to 52 in less than an hour. Outside, wind moved loose dust like sifted flour across the lot. Inside, the packed earth along the walls gave back warmth slowly, without draft or whistle. Elk Run still laughed at Tucker's gopher hole, but the arithmetic had already begun to separate jest from consequence. He worked until the lantern wick burned low, filling the last soft seam where sod met plank and tamping with the maul, until the sound turned from hollow to tight. The method came from his father, but not by inheritance alone. Eli Tucker had taught with correction, not comfort, and had made the boy dig out his own mistakes in frozen ground when a trench wall slumped or a vent drew wrong. In the river bottoms near Fort Buford, when Roy had been 13 and still narrow in the shoulders, Eli had once dismantled half a shelter after midnight because smoke had curled back at floor level. They rebuilt by moonlight with hands stiff as boards, and Eli had said, without anger, that poor building was not a private error on the plains. Poor building became a widow's burden by February. The chain of knowledge behind Eli ran farther east and farther back than Elk Run knew. Eli's mother had crossed from Tennessee Hill Country in a wagon train that lost 2 ox teams to early snow, and she had carried habits older than railroads. Bank earth before first frost, set stores below the freeze line, and leave no wall exposed to prevailing wind if hands and soil could change it. Eli had added trapper adaptations and railroad camp lessons, where men wintered in cut banks with stovepipes angled against cross drafts. Roy learned all of it by repetition, and when Eli's fever took him in 1883, the hand-copied notebook became less a keepsake than a strict ledger of obligations. At sunrise on September 14th, a thin north wind came down the open grass and held all day, and Roy began the vestibule frame on the lee side of the house, with 2 salvage doors set in sequence so one could close before the second opened. He measured the entry at 4 feet by 6, narrow by town standards, but sufficient to break draft. He sealed the sill plates with oakum and clay putty, mixed at 3 parts, screened dirt to 1 part, chopped straw, then pressed the mixture into seams with a putty knife, ground blunt so wood fibers would not tear. He kept notes while he worked. 2 pounds of nails consumed, 1/2 sack of lime remaining, 21 minutes of stove draw test under quarter-open damper. 3 boys from the schoolhouse stopped at the fence and called the place a badger den. Roy handed them each a clod and asked where the wind struck hardest on that lot by noon. 2 guessed wrong. The smallest pointed to the northwest corner where snow would later stack first. Roy nodded once and returned to work. The boys left quieter than they had arrived. By September 20th, Gideon Pike had turned mockery into policy. He stood beside the flour barrels in his store, ledger open, and told ranch hands and homesteaders that Elk Run had seen mild winters in recent years, and that coal orders could wait until after fall threshing. He spoke with merchant certainty and cited freight timing as if he commanded rail schedules himself. A ton of coal stood at $9 that week, but Pike urged families to spend ready cash on lamp oil, coffee, and white flour, while prices remained, in his phrase, civilized. Many trusted him because he extended credit, and because fear sounded ungodly when spoken too early. Roy entered for salt pork and stovepipe elbows and heard Pike's speech from 3 shelves away. He paid in coins counted twice and said nothing, while men nodded around him. Outside, he loaded his purchases beside Cedar and checked the sky again. Geese had begun crossing low and tight in ragged lines, not high and leisurely as they had the previous year at that date. Muskrat houses along the creek stood unusually high and thickened with late mud. His brass aneroid, traded by Eli in 1879 for beaver pelts and a skinning knife, had fallen steadily over 3 dawn readings despite clear afternoons. These signs did not promise catastrophe on a single day, but taken together they described strain ahead. On October 11, 1887, the town woke into a false gentleness that would have pleased any man who wished to delay hard decisions. By 2 o'clock, the board outside Pike's store showed 61 degrees in shade. Shirt sleeves replaced coats at the hitch rail, and talk shifted to late repairs and deferred purchases. Pike used the mild spell as advertisement, telling 3 farm wives and 2 teamsters that regular rail delivery would continue through winter, and that panic buying coal would only waste money better spent on flour and lamp oil. He wrote new accounts with quick pen strokes and a smile that suggested mastery over weather itself. Roy read the same warmth as warning, not relief. Too sudden, too complete, and arrived on a falling barometer. He took the last of his savings, $18.40, from a tobacco tin under his cot and spent it by evening. 2 lengths of 6-inch stovepipe, 1 adjustable damper, 1 sack of lime, 1 keg of cut nails, and 2 wagon loads of clay from the south bank where the soil held dense and fine. He paid wagon hire in coin and labor promise, then worked by lantern into the night preparing a second flue baffle to lengthen heat exchange before exhaust left the house. He cut sheet metal with hand shears and set the baffle at a measured angle inside the stovepipe run, leaving sufficient clearance to maintain draw while slowing heat loss. He tested with damp kindling first, then dry split wood, timing smoke rise and wall temperature every 10 minutes with palm and eye. Once satisfied, he lifted floor planks in the north room and sealed every gap between joists with lime straw paste over wool scraps, then reset the boards and tamped clay along the interior berm lip to stop floor-level draft. No step was dramatic. Every step mattered. The next afternoon, Pike rode past with 2 customers and reined in long enough to call over the fence. "Tucker, a dirt wall does not keep out January. You are burying labor that could earn real money." Roy set down his shovel, not hurried, not defiant. "Words do not change weather, Gideon. Preparation sometimes changes burial counts." Pike laughed for his companions, but none answered at once. By October 15th, Roy had shifted from building to storage discipline. He dug interior cache pits below frost depth, each lined with plank and coarse sand for drainage, then lowered in ceramic crocks sealed with waxed cloth and clay caps. One held dried beans and cracked wheat. One held smoked venison wrapped in rendered fat cloth. One held salt and medicinal roots in separate packets against spoilage. He marked each lid with charcoal symbols, so contents could be found by lantern in crowded dark. Above-ground shelves carried jerky strips, rye loaves baked hard for keeping, and tallow candles wrapped in paper to reduce moisture draw. He also completed the trench path between well and woodshed that townsmen had mocked as a grave cut. The trench ran 32 feet, 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep at its deepest point, cribbed with plank where the soil slumped. In clear weather it looked excessive. In drift it would be passage. He set stout posts at intervals along the trench edge and drilled iron rings through them so a rope line could be threaded when visibility failed. He tarred the rings against rust and wrote their spacing in his ledger. 7 paces, 7 paces, 6 at the bend. 3 days later, Reverend Cole came again, this time on foot, collar turned up against a sharpening wind, and asked whether Roy would consider presenting his insulation method in the church hall after Sunday service so households might at least weather strip and bank lower walls. Roy agreed at once. Cole promised to bring it to the deacons. The answer returned by note the next day, courteous and final. Formal instruction might stir alarm and imply want of faith in Providence. Roy folded the note once and put it between notebook pages without comment. By October 22nd, dawn temperature sat below freezing 4 mornings out of 5, and skim ice held in horse troughs until late sun. Roy added double plank shutters to each window opening, hung on strap hinges with interior bar slots so they could be secured from within. He left narrow vent channels at upper corners, each fitted with sliding covers, because Eli's notebook had warned that sealed warmth without managed air became sickness by morning. He tested cross-ventilation at low fire, then high fire, and adjusted until condensation no longer gathered on inner boards. That Saturday, 2 ranch hands at the hitch rail took up Pike's nickname again and asked loudly whether Roy intended to invite Moles to supper. He did not answer them. He loaded clay, drove stakes, and checked his aneroid at sunset. The needle had dropped again. By the final week of October, the mild spell had gone and not returned. Elk Run still moved through ordinary routines, but wagons began arriving from outer claims with talk of harder wind on the open reaches and creek margins setting ice earlier than expected. Roy bought no more supplies because coin was gone. He converted labor instead, trading 2 days of repair work at the livery for a sack of rye and a broken wheelbarrow he could mend. At night, he copied one more line from Eli's notebook onto fresh paper and pinned it above his workbench where lantern light reached. Heat, saved in October, is life bought in January. When November opened under a low gray ceiling and a noon temperature of 28, Roy finished the last seam on the vestibule door, banked the stove, and stepped outside to test the trench rope with gloved hands, pulling against each ring until it held fast in the strengthening wind. He held the rope until his gloves squealed against hemp, then moved to the next ring and pulled again, shoulder and back set against the strain, testing each fastening not for ordinary weather, but for the blind force that came when snow erased distance and direction alike. The posts did not shift. The iron held. He walked the 32 feet from vestibule to woodshed twice in darkness, lantern shuttered to a slit, counting paces by habit until he could have done it with his eyes closed and his face wrapped in wool. By the 5th day of November, Elk Run woke under a sky the color of dull tin and a noon temperature of 24, and Roy turned from outer walls to the hidden systems that kept a shelter from failing after its first crowded night. He raised sleeping platforms along the north room, each built from cottonwood poles and rough planks, 16 inches above floor level, so cold sink would settle beneath bodies rather than through them. He cut each platform 6 feet long and 3 feet deep, enough for 2 adults if they lay shoulder to shoulder, and he numbered them in charcoal for orderly assignment when urgency made talk ragged. He revised the stove arrangement next. The cast iron body sat on a bed of stone and packed mineral soil, but Roy extended a low heat shelf behind it with salvaged brick and clay mortar so kettles could warm without boiling, and freezing hands could be brought back by stages rather than shock. Eli Tucker's notebook had warned in 3 underlined lines that rapid thaw damaged flesh as surely as deep frost, and Roy copied those lines onto a board near the water buckets. Beside the board, he set 3 basins, one for cold well water, one for cool water tempered near the stove, and one for warm water no hand could endure for more than a count of 5. He did not call it medicine. He called it sequence. He spent one full afternoon on air alone, with walls this tight and a vestibule this narrow. Breath itself could turn a refuge into a damp fever box by dawn if vents stayed wrong. Roy cut 2 additional vent channels near the ceiling, each 3 inches wide, fitted with sliding wood covers wrapped in wool strips for quiet closure. He burned damp straw, watched smoke rise, and measured how long haze lingered at head height, with 1 vent open, then 2, then 1 plus a quarter. He settled on a pattern and wrote it in his ledger. 1 upper vent half open by day with fire moderate, 2 finger widths at night, lower draft closed unless condensation forms on south wall. The notes looked small and dry on paper. They were the difference between shelter and sickness. 3 days later, he hauled stone from the creek bend to weight the berm toe before deep frost set hard. Men at the hitch rail watched him lever each rock into the wagon and asked what enemy he expected to besiege him from underground. He answered none of it, but he did alter the south runoff swale, widening it to 20 inches and lining it with broken shale so meltwater would not soften the earthen bank in a warm break. In calm weather, the work resembled needless severity. Under a thaw-freeze cycle, it was preservation. By the 2nd week of November, he had begun disciplined fuel accounting. He split cottonwood and box elder by size class, stacked it in measured ranks, and marked each rank by chalk tallies so nightly consumption could be tracked against temperature. On November 12th, with outside lows at 11 and highs at 27, the stove held interior air between 53 and 57 degrees on 1/8 cord in 24 hours. On November the 16th, with a north wind running steady and powder snow against the west wall, he consumed slightly more than 1/6 cord to hold the same range. He didn't celebrate efficiency. He translated it into days. At this rate, reserve lasts 72 days. At harsher draw, 51. He expanded food stores with equal restraint. He traded labor at the livery for 2 sacks of dried peas and a half barrel of rye, then cured rabbit and venison in smoke so dry they could ring when tapped. He rendered tallow in small batches to avoid waste, poured it into shallow tins with twisted rag wicks, and packed the tins in sand-lined crates where mice could not reach. In the north cache, he buried 12 ceramic crocks deeper than before, each separated by packed clay, so a break in one would not spoil the others. He added 1 crock of salt solely for preserving meat that might arrive late and uncertain because winter always forced plans upon households that had made none. Elk Run, meanwhile, mistook his precision for accusation. At Pike's store, talk thickened around the stove each evening, and mockery sharpened from passing laughter into social order. Men repeated Tucker's gopher hole not as a joke but as a warning against what they called panic labor. Women who had once watched his work with neutral interest now stepped around him in the aisle, not hostile in expression, but careful not to be seen asking questions that might mark them disloyal to town confidence. Boys sang a skipping rhyme about moles and dirt at the school path, and when the schoolteacher hushed them, she did so without naming whom they mocked. Gideon Pike cultivated the tone with merchant skill. He stood broad in his well-cut coat, ledger under one arm, and told customers that proper settlements managed risk through commerce, not through burrowing like animals. He spoke of progress, of rail reliability, of moderation in all things except timidity. On November 18th, after word came that a westbound freight had stalled 2 days outside Bismarck under mechanical trouble and drifted track, Pike announced coal would rise from $9 to $17 per ton, to reflect scarcity and transport burden. He said it publicly with a hand on the scale as though quoting scripture. Some protested, but most paid what they could and signed for the rest, because stove fires did not wait for argument. Roy listened from the nail bins and bought only lamp oil, coarse salt, and 1 pound of nails for shutter braces. Pike saw him at the counter and lifted his voice for the room. There stands our engineer of soil. He has solved winter with dirt and stubbornness. Let any man here follow him into January if he wishes to sleep like a gopher. A ranch hand laughed and asked Roy whether earth walls also found him a wife and pew. The room warmed with the mean comfort of shared ridicule. Roy set coins on the plank, took his parcel, and said, "If your walls hold, keep your laughter. If they fail, come through my vestibule one at a time and close both doors." He left before anyone answered. By late November, snow began arriving in dry, granular sheets that did not melt between storms. Drifts formed first along fence lines, then hardened. Roy set additional marker stakes from his lot edge to the trench mouth, each topped with a rag strip dipped in lime wash so they would show under moonlight. He reinforced the woodshed roof pitch with cross battens, moved kindling indoors by a strict daily quota, and hung 2 spare rope coils near the vestibule latch at shoulder height, where numb hands could find them. On November the 29th, he tested emergency occupancy by inviting 3 laborers he trusted from the mill to stand inside in full coats while the stove ran low. He watched humidity gather, opened upper vents to prescribed width, and timed clear air return. 12 minutes. Acceptable. The first week of December brought a brittle cold that split bucket hoops and made horses flinch at water. Roy's berm, now frozen hard at the surface and stable beneath, shed wind cleanly. Inside he held 54 to 58 degrees through most nights, with brief dips near dawn when fuel dropped and recovered. He consumed less than 1 cord through Christmas week. In town, many frame houses burned through 2 and sometimes 3 cords in the same span, with less comfort and more draft. Fence rails vanished from lots. Broken chairs fed stoves. At dawn, ash barrels stood fuller than larders. Yet scarcity did not soften Pike's hand. On December 21st, after a second rail delay was reported west of Bismarck and freight teams turned back from block sections, he raised coal again to $23 per ton. He called it necessity and wrote the figure in thick ink above the counter. A widow named Martha Keene asked for 1/4 ton on account until her brother's remittance arrived. Pike refused credit unless she pledged her sewing machine as collateral. 2 men looked at their boots and said nothing. The machine was carried to the store before dark. Roy heard of it while patching a shutter hinge and crossed town to ask Pike whether he would release smaller coal lots for cash at old pricing to households with children and elders. Pike met him on the porch in gloves lined with fur and answered in a tone pitched to carry. "I sell goods, Tucker. I do not subsidize theatrics. Your graveyard thinking may suit boys too strange to marry or worship regular. It does not run a ledger." The words settled over the hitch rail with the ugly finality of a verdict. Roy did not step closer. "Then your ledger will meet January before you do," he said, and turned back north with his parcels under one arm. 3 days passed before Reverend Cole came again, this time not to counsel, but to observe. He stood in Roy's vestibule while snow hissed against the outer door and watched him demonstrate vent settings, baffle draw, and seal repair with lime putty. Cole asked whether these methods could be taught quickly if need rose suddenly. Roy answered that they could be taught at once but required labor and humility in equal measure. Cole removed his gloves and held his hands near the stove, then said he would raise the matter again with deacons after Christmas. The deacons, wary of panic and still deferential to Pike's assurances, postponed discussion until January. By the second week of December, warning signs multiplied with the cold precision of a clock winding down. Geese had already passed low and early, but now crows abandoned exposed cottonwoods before noon and settled in dense lee-side clusters near the creek banks. Muskrat lodges along Elk Run Creek sat higher than any old-timer recalled, their mudcaps thick and angled, as though built for spray and drift rather than ordinary freeze. Roy's aneroid fell in uneven steps, recovered briefly, then dropped deeper each dawn despite clear midday light. On December the 14th, he recorded 29.42 inches at sunrise. On December 16th, 29.18. On December 19th, after a windless morning and a red ring around the moon the previous night, 28.97. He carried those numbers to the schoolteacher, Abigail Hume, because she kept attendance for families on outer claims and could spread practical warning faster than any sermon. Hume listened, read the figures, and believed enough to tack blankets over her schoolhouse door seam and ask older pupils to bring extra mittens. But when she repeated Roy's concern at Pike's, a teamster answered that birds and rats had predicted disaster every year since Eden and were wrong most seasons. Pike said the barometer frightened young teachers because numbers looked authoritative to those without trade experience. Laughter followed. Hume bought lamp oil in silence and left with her jaw set hard. By Christmas Day, Elk Run celebrated as frontier towns did when provisions were thin, but pride remained. Hymn singing in the church, a shared meal, small gifts wrapped in newspaper, and public insistence that ordinary order still held. Roy attended the service briefly, stood at the back, and left before supper to reset his stove and check his outer markers. Some noticed and called it proof of his estrangement. Others watched him walk north through dry snow and said nothing at all. The final week of December brought a deceptive stillness, milder afternoons around 28, bright sky, and nights only slightly below zero. Men declared the severe talk finished. Pike repeated that rail would clear after New Year and told customers to conserve concern for spring mud. Roy treated the calm as he treated mockery, as weather of a different kind. He repaired one cracked vent slide, deepened the vestibule threshold lip by half an inch, and portioned food into strict daily bundles tied with twine. Beans, grain, jerky, tallow, salt. If many came, order would feed them. If order failed, stores would vanish by quarrel before hunger. On January 2nd, 1888, a dry wind from the northwest returned and did not rest. It scoured loose snow into hard, low ridges and left sky unnaturally bright at noon. Horses in town lots turned their hindquarters to the wind and stood that way for hours. Dogs refused open yards and scratched at doors until admitted. Roy checked the aneroid at dawn and dusk and found no comfort in either reading. He moved his ledger to the stove shelf, rolled spare blankets into marked stacks, and hung a slate by the door with occupancy lines already drawn. By January 6th, the morning low reached 9 below and climbing no higher than 14 by afternoon, and a fine crystalline powder began sneaking through any seam not sealed twice. Roy walked to Elk Run Creek at first light and found the ice singing under pressure, a deep, unsettled tone that carried through boots. He looked north and saw cloud bands stacked thin and fast, each layer sliding under the next like drawn blades. When he returned, he fed Cedar, banked the stove, and coiled the rescue rope at the vestibule latch, then stood for a long moment with one gloved hand on the inner door as wind pressed lightly from the other side, testing the house like a patient adversary. The pressure became a blow within the hour, a flat-handed strike against the door plank that turned light testing into insistence, and Roy slid the iron bar into place, checked the hinge pins once more, and moved through the rooms in the sequence he had rehearsed since November. Stove draw, Upper vents, water buckets, rope coils, ration crates, then the chalk slate by the vestibule where names could be written before panic scattered order. At first light on January 8th, 1888, the thermometer outside his south shutter read 28 below, freezing by noon standard. Yet the reading did not hold. By 8 o'clock it stood at 9. By 10 it dropped to 2. And before midday it crossed 0 and kept falling as if the numbers themselves had lost footing. Wind came down from the north in sustained blasts that flattened smoke at chimney height and drove snow so fine it entered through keyholes, knotholes, and eyelid seams. By nightfall, Elk Run recorded -34, and older men who had wintered cattle drives in Wyoming Territory said they had not seen such a fall in a single day since the great storms west of the Black Hills in the 70s. The first failures arrived not as drama but as small defeats multiplied by weather. A stovepipe cap tore loose from the Keene place and vanished in white. 2 window shutters at the livery ripped free and struck the packed street hard enough to splinter. At the church, the bell rope froze stiff from damp and could not be pulled even by 2 men braced heel first on the plank floor. Wagons that had stood near the hitch rail in the false calm disappeared by degrees until only the tops of their bows showed above drifting powder. The town's ordinary motion stopped by afternoon. Then the sense of distance failed with it. A doorway 20 yards away became guesswork. A barn became rumor. By sunset on January 8th, Gideon Pike's coal shed doors had sheared from their hinges and slammed open under gusts that exceeded 50 miles per hour, exposing what remained of his stock to snow that packed, froze, and turned marketable fuel into dark, useless lumps by morning. Pike and his clerks tried to drag tarps over the opening, but the tarps snapped and twisted away like paper. He had built his authority in ledger lines and polished shelves, in full barrels and controlled scarcity, yet weather did not negotiate by price. By the second morning of the storm, his front windows were filmed in interior frost, his scale pans stuck, and his back office ink had thickened in the bottle. Roy watched only long enough to understand the scale of failure beyond his lot. He did not stand at his window for vindication. He moved to arithmetic. He opened the north wall cache and counted by weight and volume, not hope. Dried beans, cracked rye, peas, venison strips, salt, tallow, and 3 sacks of potatoes stored beneath plank and sand. At strict ration, with hot broth twice daily and bread stretched with bean meal, the stores could support 40 souls for 9 days before dangerous shortage. He adjusted that figure against fuel and airflow, then cut 2 additional vent slots near the west beam where moisture would gather fastest once wet wool and crowded breath filled the room. 3 days passed before the storm gave any sign of easing, and by then Elk Run had entered the kind of collective fatigue that makes strong households fail for want of one timely decision. Men who had dismissed weatherproofing now spent full daylight hours burning furniture legs, broken fence rails, and crate slats, feeding stoves that still left ice on basin rims by dawn. Women packed quilts along door cracks and hung flour sacks over windows, then woke to frost flowers climbing interior walls as if the houses had become caves of glass. Stock animals, half buried and wind-scoured, stood with lowered heads and would not turn for calls. On January 10th, the suffering took names the town would not forget. Lena Doyle, 68 years of age, widow of a freighter and keeper of 3 grandchildren on the South Edge Road, was found seated upright beside an unlit stove when her daughter and son-in-law reached her after wind dropped enough for a rope crossing. She had wrapped her late husband's coat around a rye loaf and set it under one arm to keep it from freezing hard, preserving food for the children she expected to arrive once weather passed. Her hands were folded over the coat sleeve. There was no sign of struggle in the room, only order and cold. Deputy Marshal Tom Blevins died that same afternoon within 20 yards of the livery he had served through 5 winters. He had cut loose 2 horses from a drifted side pen and slapped them toward the Moran Lane so they could be used to pull a sled for elders if the road opened. Witnesses saw him turn back for a coil of line left near the post, lower his head into a gust, and vanish in the white between one breath and the next. When men reached him later, the rope was still looped over his shoulder. Little Caleb Moran did not survive the night of January 11th after the Moran chimney iced shut, and smoke forced the family outside into the lee side drift. His parents wrapped all 3 children in quilts and tried to hold them under the porch break until help could reach the lane. But the cold took Caleb before dawn. Neighbors found him at first light wrapped in his mother's shawl, his boots half laced from the hurried flight out of the house. He was the youngest name spoken that week. These were not the only dead across the district, but they were the names spoken in Elk Run's church with full silence between each. By January 12th, Pike's store had become the stark image of collapsed hierarchy. Shelves once crowded with sacks and tins stood stripped to bare boards and frost-rimmed nails. The flour barrels were nearly empty. Lamp oil had gone to the last inch. The coal ledger lay open on the counter with figures no one could pay and no fuel left to buy. Pike himself, once broad in posture and loud in certainty, moved from shelf to shelf with a blanket over his shoulders and a face gone gray at the mouth. He still attempted order, but order without stock was only gesture. Near dusk that day, Abigail Hume came through Roy's marker stakes with a wool scarf tied over nose and chin and a rope around her waist, trailing back to Reverend Cole, who braced at the lot edge with 2 ranch hands. Snow had crusted her lashes white. She knocked once, then twice, because the wind took the first sound. Roy opened only the outer door, pulled her into the vestibule and sealed it before unbarring the inner plank. "Speak slowly," he said. "Who is cut off and what has failed?" Hume held both hands near the heat shelf until feeling returned enough for grip. 3 households on the lower lane are trapped behind drift higher than the porch rails. Cole has 6 elders in the church with 1 stove failing draw. Pike says he can shelter none. The schoolhouse has blankets, but no fuel worth speaking of. We need movement lines now, not tomorrow. Roy nodded once. How many can walk if led by rope? Most, if paired. 2 cannot. He took chalk to slate. Then we move in teams of 2 carriers and 1 guide. No one breaks line for property. No one returns for trunks. Bread and blankets only. Cole entered next, then the 2 ranch hands, stamping snow in the vestibule and waiting without argument while Roy assigned sequence. He gave Cole the first coil and set him at the church route, where marker stakes were closest. He sent 1 ranch hand with Hume toward the lower lane and kept the other for his own line to the Moran and Keene houses. He did not ask for deference. He issued tasks. In weather like this, hierarchy belonged to the method that worked. By the morning of January 13th, Roy's trench path had become the town's narrow artery. He tied lifelines from fence post to porch beam, then from porch beam to wagon tongue where markers had vanished, building a continuous line that gloved hands could follow when sight failed. Souls moved along it bent double, wrapped in quilts and horse blankets, each instructed to keep 1 hand on rope and the other on the shoulder ahead. At every arrival, Roy or Hume marked names on the slate, counted heads, and directed placement by heat need, not social standing. Inside, the house changed function without losing discipline. Sleeping platforms took elders first. The floor near the stove rotated those with severe chill in measured intervals to prevent overheating. Wet coats were hung in the vestibule to freeze dry before being beaten and rehung. Soup kettles ran thin but steady. Vent slots were adjusted every 2 hours to keep condensation from turning walls slick and airfoul. Pike's former customers lay beside Pike's former debtors under the same wool. and listened to the same instructions, and no one disputed assignment once the wind struck the shutters hard enough to shake loose old pride. Late that afternoon, Gideon Pike arrived hatless, beard iced, carrying his account book under one arm as if habit had survived where confidence had not. He stood in the vestibule with shoulders trembling from cold and looked at Roy for a moment that held the full weight of every porch remark and storehouse jeer of the preceding year. Roy took the ledger from his hand and set it on a crate away from Meltwater. "Stove watch, second shift," he said. "You will keep kettle level at half. Turn brick warmers every 40 minutes and carry snow for melt when called. If you can stand, you can work." Pike gave one short nod. No bargain was requested. None was offered. By nightfall on January 14th, 81 souls had passed through the Tucker house in shifts, some staying, some warming and moving on to stabilized homes once lines were set and stoves repaired. Roy's rations held because measurement held. His walls held because earth held. And while the storm still moved over Elk Run like a grinding blade, the town had at last a method stronger than opinion. Roy kept the stove schedule through that first night with the same discipline he had used when he lived alone. Only now each instruction moved through 3 rooms and 81 exhausted souls. He set Pike beside the heat shelf and showed him the baffle lever, the damper notch, and the vent sliders, making him repeat each setting aloud until the order could be followed without error. He sent Abigail Hume to inventory mittens, socks, and dry wraps by size, and he assigned Reverend Cole to doorway control so no one opened both vestibule doors at once and bled heat into the storm. The house that had been mocked as Tucker's gopher hole now ran like a small fort under siege, not by force of personality but by sequence, measurement, and labor shared in plain sight. By dawn on January 15th, the wind still struck hard, yet the movement lines held, and Roy began teaching while he rescued. At each stove repair call he carried the same tools: a wire brush, spare pipe joint, clay putty, and a folded scrap with draft angles marked in pencil. He knelt in strangers' kitchens and showed fathers and widows how to clear iced caps from below with a weighted line, how to shorten exposed pipe runs that chilled and stalled smoke, how to leave 2-finger widths at upper vents even when fear urged complete sealing. "Warmth and air must be governed together," he said again and again. "A tight room can kill as quickly as open wind." Men who had laughed from the hitch rail copied him with shaking hands and did exactly as told. He opened his buried crocks in strict order: beans first, then rye, then venison, with salt counted by spoon and tallow by ounce. No family was turned away. No family took more than ration. Pike, who had once measured survival in ledgers and collateral, stood over the cutting board and weighed portions on his own store scale, now carried to Roy's table because the store itself had gone near useless. The contrast needed no sermon. One young mother held a bowl of thin bean broth and said she had paid $23 for a ton of coal she never received. Roy only told her to keep the bowl covered between sips and stay near the inner wall through the night. Through January 16th and 17th, the gusts still tore at shutters and eaves, but no line team moved blind anymore. Roy used each short lull to push instructions outward, and each hard blast to pull people inward by order of heat need. He drew a map of Elk Run from memory on a pine plank and marked each household by condition: stable stove, failing stove, no fuel, injured, elders alone, children under 10. Then he organized line teams in rotating watches, pairing strong walkers with careful hands, rather than status with status. Pike asked where he should be posted. Roy put him on the south route with meltwater barrels and fuel fragments collected from collapsed sheds, the coldest and least admired work in town. Pike accepted and went. On January 18th, The storm front finally broke into ragged intervals of cloud and brittle sun, and Elk Run stepped out into a landscape altered past recognition. Drifts stood higher than porch roofs in places. Fences had vanished entirely. 2 barns had caved under load. The church cupola leaned 6 inches off, true. Yet the district had living households where none would have remained without the rope lines, the ration discipline, and the dirt-banked rooms that held at 54 to 58, while thin-framed houses bled heat into white air. 3 days passed before the first formal count could be made. Across Elk Run and the outer lanes, 29 souls had died. The names were written in the church register in careful ink, and no one spoke during the reading. Afterward, there was no cheering for survival, no appetite for triumph. There was work, burial in frozen ground, cut by picks and fire-thawed trenches, chimney repairs, animal recovery, inventory of flour, lamp oil, and seed grain. Roy joined all of it. He took no place of honor at any table. By the second week of February, the weather steadied into deep cold without blizzard, and the social order that had governed Elk Run before the storm began to crack under the weight of what everyone had seen. Men who had repeated Pike's nickname now asked for berm measurements and vent spacing. Women who had crossed the street to avoid Roy at the store walked to his lot with notebooks and string. Abigail Hume organized evening instruction at the schoolhouse, despite smoke-blackened walls and half-frozen benches. Roy stood by the stove and taught in the same plain cadence he had used at rescue sites. Wall orientation, berm slope, clay straw ratio, trench width, food cache depth, and the arithmetic of fuel per day against outside temperature. He charged nothing. The reckoning came gradually, and because it came gradually, it could not be dismissed as theater. One morning, Martha Keene appeared with her sewing machine receipt in hand, now canceled and signed by Gideon Pike. Pike had returned it himself and repaid the excess coal charge in coin and flour credit. 2 days later, he did the same for 2 widows from the West Lane, then for a ranch hand whose children had slept in Roy's vestibule during the worst night. By late February, he had sold inventory below replacement cost to clear debts he had no legal duty to forgive, but which he now treated as moral arrears. When March thaw began, it came in gray sheets and roofline drips, and with it came the first open acknowledgement in civic record. At a town council meeting held March 9, 1888, before a room still smelling of wet wool and lime plaster, the clerk entered this line into formal minutes. The Tucker Earth Bank construction preserved life where standard framing failed. No one objected. No one laughed at the old nickname. Outside, boys who once sang about moles now hauled clay and sled boxes to deepen their own family berms. Gideon Pike's reckoning was the most visible and the least comfortable. He sold the general store at a loss to a merchant from Yankton who agreed to fixed winter coal contracts in writing, then moved out of his back office and into a rented room near the livery. Within a week, he came north with a shovel and asked Roy where to start. Roy pointed to the borrow pit and told him to screen stones from clay and keep water content low enough that a squeezed handful held shape without gloss. Pike worked from sunup to dusk, broadcloth coat replaced by patched wool, gloves stiff with mud and thaw. The man who had named Tucker's Gopher Hole now spent spring building 3 such berms for families who could not pay in cash. At the April church gathering, the room held nearly every household that remained in district limits. Reverend Cole opened with prayer for the dead, then stepped aside and asked if any soul wished to speak. Several did, one after another, not as spectacle but as burden laid down publicly. A rancher quoted his own words from November, admitting he had called Roy a burrowing fool. A deacon admitted the church had refused instruction for fear of panic and had confused pride with providence. Abigail Hume spoke of carrying children through the rope line and said the lesson belonged in the schoolhouse every autumn. Then Pike stood. His voice had lost its porch thunder. I called his house Tucker's Gopher Hole to turn labor into ridicule. I raised coal when fear rose because I believed scarcity was a market before it was a danger. When weather stripped my shelves bare, I walked into that same house with an account book as if numbers could warm me. He gave me work by the stove and fed me from food he buried when I was still laughing. I was wrong in judgment and wrong in conduct. I do not ask that wrong be erased. I ask only to remain here long enough to repair what I can with my own hands. The room stayed silent until Cole looked to Roy. Roy stood with both hands resting on the back of the bench before him, shoulders still lean, face still wind-burned, 19 no longer seeming young in that room. He did not offer easy absolution. My father taught me that shelter is a duty, not a commodity, he said. He learned it from his mother in hard country, where winter took the proud and the humble alike. I did not bank those walls to win an argument. I banked them because weather does not pardon neglect. You ask about forgiveness. I cannot make that a quick word for this room. 29 are dead across this district. Their absence has weight. What I can offer is instruction to any household willing to work. Full method, no charge. If you learn it and teach it onward, that will answer more than apology. No applause followed. The response was labor. What followed over the next years was less dramatic and more decisive. By October 1888, 1 full year after the false warm spell, 11 homes in Elk Run had completed earth banks to windowsill height. 6 had built full berms to shoulder height, and the schoolhouse had added packed sod thermal skirts along its north and west walls. Roy supervised where asked and corrected where necessary, often with Pike carrying clay beside him. Fuel use dropped sharply in poorer households first because they adopted the method most completely. County ledgers for winter 1889 showed average coal purchase in Elk Run at nearly 1/3 below the previous 3-year mean, despite harsher December winds. The savings remained in kitchen jars, seed orders, and doctor fees paid on time. By 1902, travelers entering from the South Road counted 27 earth-banked homes within and around Elk Run, with trench paths, vented stoves, and cache pits built to measure depth. The public granary carried a carved beam over its main door. Pack earth before frost and pride after. Schoolchildren copied the sentence in winter copybooks. Abigail Hume, now principal teacher, required upper pupils to calculate heat retention by wall type and fuel load each November. Reverend Cole, older and slower, blessed no house raising until he had asked whether berm and vents had been planned first. Roy Tucker never turned the method into patent or payment scheme. He kept a modest crew in hard seasons, took wages when offered, and waived them when widows or newly arrived families had only labor to trade. He amended his father's notebook in a steadier hand than Eli had left him, adding Elk Run measurements, storm durations, failure points, and repair intervals. On the inside cover, he wrote the district death count from January 1888 and left 3 blank lines below it for names no town should ever need to add again. The house on the stony quarter lot still stands in present weather, berm renewed and timber replaced where time required, used each winter as instruction hall, storage, and refuge when storms run long. The rope rings remain set at 7 paces, 7 paces, 6 at the bend. Elders call it the Gopher House now without contempt, the old insult worn down into respect by repetition and memory. In Elk Run, fuel bills for the poorest families remain the smallest in the county, and each autumn before first frost, neighbors can be seen with shovels at their walls, packing dirt in quiet agreement with a lesson paid for once at terrible cost. On the first Monday after that year's harvest, wagons cleared the South Road. Roy stood at the granary beam while Pike held the ladder steady, and the two men rubbed fresh linseed oil into the carved words until the grain darkened and the cut letters caught morning light. Children from the schoolhouse waited in two lines with slate boards in their arms, and Abigail Hume, now with silver at both temples, called the older pupils forward to read aloud one at a time. No one stumbled over the sentence. They had written it every November for years. Reverend Cole arrived last, walking with a cane cut from ash, and paused at the threshold until Roy stepped down from the ladder. Cole removed his hat and handed Roy a folded paper browned at the edges. This was the deacon's refusal from October 1887, he said. I kept it in my Bible as rebuke. The school board voted last week to place it in the winter instruction chest with your first Venn diagrams, that no one may claim ignorance as righteousness again. Roy read the note once, folded it along the same crease, and passed it to Abigail. Then place it where the older students can see both pages together, he said. The refusal and the correction. Lessons require both. That afternoon, with wind already carrying the dry metal smell of coming cold, the town ran its autumn shelter drill in full order. The church bell rope that had frozen solid in the storm of 1888 had been replaced 3 times and kept greased with tallow each week from October through March. When Cole rang it now, the tone carried clear over Elk Run Creek, and households stepped into motion without shouting. Door seams were checked. Upper vents were opened to measured width. Cache lids were lifted, inspected for damp, then sealed. At Roy's instruction hall, 12 new families laid out their stored goods for inspection on long plank tables. He moved down the first table with Abigail marking results in a ledger. Beans are dry, he said to a ranch wife from the outer lane, tapping the crock lid with his knuckles. Good seal. Move this one 2 inches higher on sand. You had minor ground damp last winter. At the next station, Pike weighed flour sacks and called out numbers while Elsie Moran, now 26 and the district nurse, inspected tallow for spoilage by smell and color. The same account book Pike had carried into Roy's vestibule during the blizzard lay open beside the scale, but its columns had changed purpose. No debt marks remained. He had torn those pages out in spring 1888 and turned them over to the council clerk with witness signatures, then kept the book as an inventory register for community stores. He still wrote in a merchant hand, sharp and narrow, but the entries now ended with allocation notes rather than collateral demands. Near sundown, Roy unlocked the north wall cache in the original Tucker house and invited the oldest school pupils to gather close. He showed them the ceramic crocks that had once carried 81 souls through the worst week. One for beans, one for rye, one for venison, one for salt. Each marked with the same charcoal symbols he had cut when he was 19. These are no relics, he said. You will scrub and reset them tomorrow. Use coarse sand at the base, then dry plank, then vessel. If one cracks, isolate it. Do not let one vessel ruin 4. A boy asked whether the symbols mattered if one could read labels. Roy pointed to the lantern and blew it out, leaving only embers from the stove. Read that label now, he said. In the dim room, the chalk letters vanished, but the carved marks could still be felt by touch. The boy nodded and traced each symbol with his fingers until he could name them in the dark. 3 days later, with frost whitening the ditch grass and the morning temperature at 26, the council met to settle the winter contracts. The new storekeeper from Yankton presented fixed coal rates in writing, witnessed by 2 ranchers and the clerk, and agreed to a standing poor household reserve that could not be sold at speculative increase. Pike, no longer proprietor, rose from the rear bench and asked leave to speak before signatures were made. His coat was patched at both elbows, his hands roughened by clay and lime. I sold fear in winter and called it commerce, he said, voice low but steady. I ask that this contract carry one more line. If rail fails, the reserve opens by need list kept jointly by school and church, not by purse. I will volunteer tally duty each morning with Abigail Hume and submit numbers to council at dusk. No one objected. Cole added the line in his own hand. The contract passed unanimous. By the second week of November, Roy had begun advanced instruction for 20 apprentices from Elk Run and 3 neighboring settlements. He did not soften the curriculum for comfort. On the first evening, he laid Eli Tucker's notebook on the table beside his own amended copy and made each student recite the generational chain before touching tools. Eli's mother from Tennessee Hill Country, Eli in River Bottom trapping camps, Roy in Elk Run, then onward through whoever listened and labored. Knowledge that isn't taught decays faster than timber, he said. You will not hoard this. The class practiced vent balancing with live smoke tests under varying draft conditions. They rebuilt a baffle assembly from scrap pipe and timed heat retention at 1-hour intervals. They dug a training trench to exact dimensions, 32 feet, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep at center, and set rope rings at 7 paces. 7 paces, 6 at the bend. Because a method remembered in calm must remain exact under pressure. Elsie taught frost injury sequence using the 3-basin protocol that Roy had posted in charcoal during the blizzard. Abigail taught household counting and name slate discipline, so no soul would be left unaccounted in shifting shelter rotations. At the first heavy snow of that winter, Elk Run tested the system for truth rather than ceremony. A 2-day blow from the northwest dropped temperatures to -18 with gusts above 40. Hard enough to drift lane fences and blind the lower crossing. The bell rang before dawn. Lines were set in less than 20 minutes. 42 souls rotated through warming posts by noon without injury beyond minor frostbite. 2 stove failures were corrected before smoke accumulated. No household exhausted fuel. The poorest lane, once first to suffer, reported lowest overnight consumption, because their berms had been packed deepest and their vents set to standard. After the drill, with snow still ticking against shutters, Pike approached Roy at the doorway of the old gopher house and removed his gloves slowly, as one does when approaching a grave. There is one matter I withheld, he said. During the blizzard, when I carried that ledger in here, there was a page marked with the Keene machine, the Doyle account, and 3 other collateral claims I could still have enforced after thaw. I burned it at my stove before dawn on January 15th, 1888, and did not speak of it because I feared it would sound like purchase of mercy. I speak now because my silence has outlived its use. Roy considered him without haste. You burned the power before anyone could demand it, he said. That was the first honest entry you made that winter. Keep making them. Cole, hearing the exchange from the heat shelf, bowed his head once and returned to sharpening stove scrapers for the next class. He never interrupted the moment, and he never revisited it for public effect. When spring came in 1903, a delegation from 2 counties west rode in to study Elk Run's system after losing stock and shelter to early storms. Roy refused payment for lectures and required each visitor to spend 1 full day in labor before receiving copied plans. By the 4th day, hands that had arrived soft from office work were blistered and steady, and the visitors left with rolled diagrams, measured material lists, and a warning spoken in the same plain cadence Eli had once used. Weather does not bargain with pride. Years pass, and the method remains. The Tucker house still stands on the stony quarter lot north of town, earthen berm renewed each autumn, south wall catching low winter light exactly as staked in 1887. The original brass aneroid hangs above the instruction bench, recalibrated and compared weekly against a newer instrument, not as shrine but as working tool. Eli Tucker's notebook rests in a pine case lined with wool, pages flattened, corners repaired, margins full of Roy's additions in darker ink. The council minutes of March 9th, 1888 are copied and posted each October beside the deacon's old refusal so memory cannot select only the flattering half. Pike dies in his 70s with clay still under his nails from late-season berm work. At his burial, no one speaks of his porch laughter first. Cole is already gone by then, Abigail not far behind, and Elsie Moran leads the winter school herself, reading names from the old slate before each storm drill, and pausing longest at Lena Doyle, Tom Blevins, and Caleb Moran, because instruction without grief grows careless. Roy grows old without leaving Elk Run. On clear mornings, he still walks the rope line from vestibule to shed, gloved hand moving ring to ring, testing iron against wind. Children walk with him now and count the spacing allowed. When they finish, they pack dirt at the wall base until the berm rises smooth and tight before first frost, and no one in town calls that labor strange.